One of the few perks of my job is that it sends me all over the country. Most of the time, it's nothing glamorous. I'm usually bouncing between regional offices, sitting through endless client meetings, and eating forgettable hotel breakfasts while pretending powdered eggs are edible. But every once in a while, the work takes me somewhere beautiful enough to almost make the stress worth it. That was how I ended up in Western North Carolina 3 years ago. It was late October, and the Blue Ridge Mountains looked unreal. The hills were painted in deep orange, crimson, and gold, stretching endlessly beneath a cold gray sky. Everywhere I looked felt like a postcard. Normally, my company books chain hotels near whatever office I'm visiting, but this trip was different. My meetings weren't until the evenings, and after a brutal few months of nonstop work, I desperately needed some peace and quiet. So instead of staying in Asheville, I rented a house through a vacation rental site. The property was called Raven Ridge Retreat, perched high on a narrow mountain road about 30 minutes outside town. The listing looked incredible. It was a 2-story cedar house tucked into the trees with massive windows facing the valley below. The photos showed a wraparound deck, a stone fireplace, and enough isolation to make it feel like the rest of the world had disappeared. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The drive up had already put me slightly on edge. The road twisted sharply through thick forest with steep drops hidden behind walls of fog. There were long stretches where my GPS lost signal entirely. By the time I reached the house, dusk had already settled. The place looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. Tall pine trees surrounded it on all sides, their branches creaking softly in the wind. The back deck overlooked a steep wooded slope that dropped into darkness. The silence was what struck me first. No traffic, no distant voices, not even birds, just the wind. Inside, everything was spotless. The owner had left a welcome note on the kitchen island along with a bottle of local wine. I unpacked, poured myself a glass, and spent an hour sitting on the deck watching the last traces of daylight disappear over the mountains. For the first time in months, I felt calm. That night, I turned in early. The next morning, I woke around 6 and decided to go for a run. The rental listing had mentioned several hiking trails branching off near the property, so I threw on my running shoes and headed out. At first, it was incredible. The air was crisp enough to sting my lungs, and the woods glowed with morning light filtering through the leaves. But after about 15 minutes, I started feeling uneasy. You know that strange sensation when you're absolutely certain someone is watching you? That prickling heat at the back of your neck? I felt it. I stopped several times and turned around. Nothing. The trail behind me was empty. Still, I kept hearing small sounds, a snap of twigs, a crunch of leaves, always just far enough behind me to suggest movement. Every time I stopped, the sounds stopped too. I told myself it was probably deer or squirrels. The mountains were full of wildlife, but logic didn't stop the feeling growing heavier in my chest. Eventually, I cut the run short and headed back to the house. Once inside, I laughed at myself. City nerves, that was all. I took a shower, made coffee, and spent the rest of the morning answering emails while trying to shake the irrational paranoia. Around 4 that afternoon, I drove into town for work. The meetings dragged on until almost 8. Afterwards, some coworkers invited me to a bar nearby. I accepted immediately. The truth was, I didn't want to go back to that house yet. I couldn't explain why. Nothing had happened, but the thought of returning alone to that isolated mountain property made my stomach tighten. At the bar, I stayed longer than I intended. A couple beers turned into 3, then 4. By the time I finally left, it was nearly 11. The drive back was miserable. Fog had rolled in thick across the mountain roads, reducing visibility to almost nothing. My headlights barely cut through it. Every sharp turn felt like I was driving straight into a wall of white. When I finally reached Raven Ridge, relief washed over me. I parked, hurried inside, and immediately locked the door. Then I checked it again and again. Front door, sliding deck door, kitchen window latches, every single lock, 3 times. Only then did I head upstairs to bed. But sleep didn't come. The house made noises. Not unusual ones, just the natural sounds old wooden homes make, the settling creaks, the occasional groan of floorboards adjusting to temperature changes. Still, each sound jolted me awake. Midnight came. Then 1. I lay there staring at the ceiling, increasingly frustrated. Finally, around 1:15, I gave up. I grabbed my jacket and decided to step onto the deck for some air. Maybe the cold would help settle my nerves. My cigarettes were downstairs in my bag by the kitchen. I headed down in darkness, using the faint moonlight pouring through the large windows to guide me. Halfway down the staircase, I froze. There was movement below. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shifting shadows outside, but then I saw it again. A shape, standing motionless in the kitchen. My entire body locked up. The moonlight coming through the rear windows outlined the figure just enough to make out its shape. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still beside the kitchen island. For several seconds, neither of us moved. I couldn't even breathe. Then he stepped forward. Moonlight hit his face. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, with long, greasy hair hanging around his shoulders and a thick beard covering most of his face. His eyes were fixed directly at me. Not confused, not startled, focused, like he'd been waiting. Then he smiled and sprinted towards the stairs. I don't remember making the decision. Instinct took over. I turned and ran upstairs faster than I thought possible. His footsteps thundered behind me. I reached the bedroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it just as something heavy smashed against the other side. The entire frame shook. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. Another impact, then another. He was trying to break through. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped my phone while dialing 911. The dispatcher answered. I barely got the address out through panicked gasps. She told me officers were on their way and instructed me to stay hidden. Then the man spoke. His voice was low and strangely calm. "Lena," he said, through the door. My blood ran cold. That was my name. "I know you're in there." I had never seen this man before in my life. He hit the door again. Wood splintered. Then, almost gently, he said, "I've been waiting for you to come back." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't random. Whoever he was, he believed that house belonged to someone else, and somehow he thought I was her. For a few seconds after he said those words, I couldn't move. My back was pressed against the bedroom wall, my phone trembling so hard in my hand that I nearly dropped it. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher kept asking if I was still there. I could barely answer. "Yes," I whispered. "He's trying to get in." Another violent slam hit the door. The entire frame shuddered. Wood splintered near the lock. I looked around desperately for something, anything I could use to defend myself. The bedroom was sparsely furnished. A queen-size bed, a wooden dresser, a bedside lamp. Nothing remotely useful against a full-grown man trying to break down the door. The dispatcher told me officers were about 15 minutes away. 15 minutes? It might as well have been 15 hours. The man hit the door again, harder this time. A fist burst partially through the wood. I screamed. The dispatcher heard it and began shouting instructions I barely processed. Then the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I stood frozen, staring at the jagged hole in the center of the door. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. I couldn't hear footsteps retreating. No creaking floorboards. Just complete silence. The dispatcher was still speaking, her voice sharp now. "Lena, are you there? What's happening?" He stopped. "Can you hear him?" "No." "Stay where you are. Do not open that door." I swallowed hard and looked toward the bedroom window. It faced the side of the house, opening onto the sloped metal roof covering the lower porch. Not ideal, but if he broke through that door, it might be my only option. I slowly crossed the room and unlocked it. The cold mountain air rushed inside immediately. I climbed halfway out and carefully lowered myself onto the slick metal roof. It was steeper than it looked. My sneakers slipped slightly and panic shot through me. Below was a 15-foot drop into wet leaves and rock. Not impossible, but dangerous. I crouched low and stayed perfectly still. Inside the room, I heard the door finally give way with a loud crack. The sound echoed through the house. Heavy footsteps entered the bedroom. He was inside. My breathing stopped completely. From my position outside, I could hear him moving around, slowly, methodically, like he was searching. Then his voice drifted through the open window. "Lena? Closer now. Softer. Almost affectionate. You don't have to hide." I pressed myself flat against the cold metal roof. His footsteps approached the window. For one horrifying second, I thought he would lean out and see me. Instead, he stopped. Then he laughed. It was low and unsettling. Not wild or manic. Controlled. Like he knew something I didn't. "You always did make this harder than it had to be." The words sent ice through my veins. He genuinely believed I was someone else. Then I heard sirens, faint at first, then growing louder. The man inside froze. Everything went still. A second later, he moved fast, not toward the window, toward the stairs. I heard him running, then a loud crash downstairs, probably the front door. Moments later, flashing red and blue lights painted the trees. I scrambled to my feet on the roof and screamed for help. An officer spotted me immediately. Within minutes, they helped me down. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. The officers swept the house. The man was gone. He'd escaped through the kitchen's sliding glass door, which police later discovered had been unlocked the entire time. I know I locked it. I know I did. I checked it 3 times. That meant only one thing. He had already been inside when I arrived. The realization made me physically sick. The officers searched the property for over an hour, but found nothing. No footprints, no sign of where he'd gone. Just darkness and endless forest. I sat in the back of a patrol SUV wrapped in a blanket while one of the deputies questioned me. I explained everything. The trail that morning, the strange noises, seeing him in the kitchen, hearing him call me by name. That part caught their attention. "How did he know your name?" the deputy asked. I had no answer. Then they contacted the homeowner. Her name was Marissa. She arrived nearly an hour later, visibly shaken. The moment she stepped out of her car and saw me, something strange happened. She stopped dead. Her face lost all color. For several seconds, she just stared. Then she whispered, "Oh my God." At first, I thought she was reacting to the situation, but then she looked directly at me and said, "You look exactly like her." The deputy asked what she meant. Marissa hesitated before explaining. 5 years ago, she'd been engaged to a man named Daniel. They'd planned to live together in that house after renovating it. But the relationship ended badly, very badly. Daniel had become obsessive and unstable. After she left him, he disappeared completely. No calls, no messages, no sightings, nothing. She eventually assumed he'd moved on or left the state. Then she showed us a photo on her phone, a picture of her younger sister, Claire, and my stomach dropped. Claire looked disturbingly like me. Same dark hair, same facial structure, even similar height. Not identical, but close enough that in dim lighting, with enough delusion, someone could mistake us. Marissa explained that Daniel had once been fixated on Claire too. Not romantically exactly, more like he viewed her as some kind of interference in their relationship. He blamed her for convincing Marissa to leave him. The police searched further and eventually made a horrifying discovery. Inside a narrow storage closet beneath the upstairs staircase, they found evidence that someone had been living there for days. Empty food wrappers, water bottles, beer cans, a stained sleeping bag, and taped to the back wall,
photos of me, dozens of them, printed screenshots from the rental platform's guest verification system, the profile photo I'd uploaded when booking, my LinkedIn headshot, even a few pictures pulled from social media. He had known I was coming. He had seen my face, and he had decided I was Claire. He had been waiting in that house before I arrived, watching, listening, planning. 2 days later, police arrested Daniel. He was found hiding in an abandoned hunting cabin roughly 8 miles from Raven Ridge. He had a kitchen knife tucked into his belt, the same knife missing from the rental property. He never explained what he intended to do. During questioning, he reportedly kept insisting he was bringing her back. I testified months later. He was sentenced to several years in a psychiatric correctional facility. That should have been the end of it, but even now, 3 years later, I still can't stay alone in isolated places. I check every lock obsessively, sometimes twice, sometimes 10 times. And so often, usually just as I'm drifting off to sleep, I remember that voice outside the broken bedroom door. Calm, patient, certain. I've been waiting for you to come back. The part that still haunts me most isn't what happened. It's this. If I hadn't gone downstairs for that cigarette, if I had fallen asleep just a little earlier, I probably would have woken up with him standing over my bed. And I honestly don't know if I'd still be here to tell this story.
2 years ago, I drove nearly 6 hours from Charleston, West Virginia, to a small town called Ashford Hollow for what I thought might be the biggest opportunity of my life. At the time, I was 28 and desperate for a career change. I'd spent almost 6 years working as an assistant manager at a hardware store, and while it paid the bills, I hated every second of it. The long shifts, the fake smiles, the endless customer complaints. I felt stuck. When a logistics company in Ashford Hollow called me for an in-person interview for a regional operations position, it felt like the break I'd been waiting for. The pay was nearly double what I was making, full benefits, a relocation package, everything I'd been hoping for. My fiancée, Rachel, was the one who convinced me not to drive back the same day. "You'll be exhausted," she said while scrolling through rental listings on her phone. "Just stay the night somewhere, get some sleep, and drive back fresh in the morning." I'm not great with apps or online booking stuff. Rachel handled all that. She found a rental home just 10 minutes from the company headquarters. The place looked nice enough in the listing photos. A 2-story brick house with a wide front porch tucked into a quiet suburban neighborhood. The owner, a guy named Derek, messaged me shortly after booking. He seemed friendly. When I told him I was coming for an interview, he even offered to let me check in early so I could shower and get ready before heading over. That should have been my first clue. Not because it was suspicious, because it was unusually accommodating. Sometimes when people go out of their way to be helpful, there's a reason. I just didn't know it yet. I arrived in Ashford Hollow around noon. The neighborhood was older but well kept. The house itself looked exactly like the listing. Dark red brick, white shutters, a keypad lock on the front door. The whole place had this clean, staged look to it, like no one had actually lived there in years. I punched in the code Derek had sent me and let myself inside. The house was spotless, almost too spotless. There's a weird kind of silence in places that aren't regularly lived in. You notice it immediately. No hum of appliances, no creaking floorboards, no distant TV from another room, just stillness. I dropped my overnight bag by the stairs and looked around. The living room was huge, centered around a stone fireplace with a massive flat screen mounted above it. A wraparound sectional couch took up most of the room. Honestly, it looked comfortable enough that I immediately decided I'd sleep there instead of using one of the bedrooms. Something about rental beds always freaked me out. The interview went surprisingly well. Better than well, actually. By the time I left, I was cautiously optimistic. The hiring manager had smiled the whole time, taken detailed notes, and ended our conversation by saying, "I think you'd fit in here very well." That one sentence carried me through the rest of the evening. I grabbed takeout from a taco place nearby and headed back to the house feeling better than I had in months. I called Rachel while I ate. We talked for almost an hour.
She teased me about already mentally spending the higher salary. I teased her back about making me move to the middle of nowhere. Everything felt normal, comfortable, promising. Around 10:30, I started winding down. I dimmed the lights, grabbed a blanket from upstairs, and settled onto the couch with a movie. I'd barely made it 20 minutes in before I started drifting off. Then the doorbell rang. I jerked awake so hard my neck cracked. At first, I thought it was part of the movie. Then it rang again, sharp, clear, real. I checked my phone. 11:27 p.m. Who the hell rings someone's doorbell that late? I stayed still for a moment, waiting. Maybe they'd realized they had the wrong house. Then it rang a third time, longer this time, more deliberate. Annoyed, I got up and walked towards the front windows. The porch light was dim, but I could make out a thin man standing on the steps. He was holding a small brown paper bag. His head was tilted downward so far that I couldn't see his face. Something about the way he stood made my stomach tighten. Too still, too rigid. I cracked open the front door but kept the screen door locked. Yeah? Without looking up, he spoke in a flat, emotionless voice. Pizza delivery. I frowned. I didn't order pizza. No response. Just silence. Then, after several seconds, he repeated, pizza delivery. Same exact tone, same exact pacing, like a recording. You've got the wrong house. Still, he didn't move, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge what I'd said. I shut the main door and started walking back towards the living room. The bell rang again. This time it startled me enough to actually make me curse out loud. I marched back and yanked open the door. Listen, man, nobody ordered anything. Slowly, he raised his head. I could finally see his face. Pale, gaunt, blank. His eyes looked almost unfocused, like he was looking through me instead of at me. Then he spoke. The delivery is for this address. And he recited the house number perfectly. A chill ran down my spine. That's great, I snapped, still not mine. As I said it, I noticed his hand move. He was gripping the screen door handle, testing it, just slightly. I slammed the main door shut hard enough to rattle the frame. Get lost before I call the cops. I backed away from the window and crouched low enough to peek through the blinds. He stood there motionless for another full minute. Then he turned and walked towards the driveway. A battered red sedan was parked there. One headlight was busted. He got inside. I exhaled. Finally. But the relief didn't last. The engine stayed running, the headlights stayed on, and the car didn't move. It just sat there, idling, facing the house, its single functioning headlight shining directly through the front windows like a spotlight. I stared at it for nearly 5 minutes. Nothing. No movement. No sign of the driver. Finally, irritation got the better of caution. I threw on my shoes, and if this creep wanted to play games, fine, I'd scare him off. I stormed out the front door and marched down the porch steps towards the driver's side window. But when I got there, the seat was empty. The car was still running, still in park, driver's door locked, no one inside. My blood turned to ice. I slowly turned around. The house stood behind me in total silence. Dark windows, still porch light, open front door. And for the first time that night, I had the overwhelming, sickening realization that while I'd been focused on the driveway, someone could have walked right past me and gone inside. I sprinted back to the porch and slammed the door shut behind me, locked the chain. Then I backed away, heart hammering so violently I could hear it in my ears. That's when I noticed something. The faint sound of footsteps, not outside, inside, from somewhere upstairs, and they were moving slowly across the floor. For several seconds, I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps came again, slow, measured, heavy enough to make the floorboards groan faintly overhead. I remember telling myself there had to be some logical explanation. Old houses settle, wood shifts, heat vents click and creak. That's what I wanted to believe. But deep down, I already knew better. The timing was impossible. I had just discovered the red sedan sitting empty in the driveway. I had just realized someone could have slipped past me while I was outside. And now there were footsteps directly above my head, the kind made by deliberate movement, not settling wood, not plumbing, not imagination. A person. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. No signal. At first, I thought panic was making me read it wrong. I held it higher, moved toward the front window, then toward the kitchen. Still nothing. No bars. The Wi-Fi. I needed the Wi-Fi. Derek had left the password on a little framed card sitting on the kitchen counter. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it while typing. Connected. Immediately, I opened my messages and texted Rachel. Something's wrong here. I think someone's inside the house. The message failed. I tried again. Failed. Then I noticed the Wi-Fi signal had vanished. Disconnected. Just gone. I looked up at the router mounted near the ceiling over the staircase. Its lights were off. Someone had unplugged it. That's when the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I couldn't even hear the car outside anymore. No engine, no movement, nothing. I stared at the staircase, half expecting someone to come casually walking down like they belonged there. Instead, I heard a soft metallic sound, a click, coming from the hallway upstairs, like a door handle being tested. Then another, click, another. Whoever was up there was checking doors, methodically, one by one, even though every bedroom was empty. It took me a second to understand what that meant. They were looking for me. I backed away slowly until my legs hit the couch. I crouched behind it, trying to think. Calling the police wasn't an option without signal. Running out the front door meant crossing open ground with no idea if the man in the driveway was waiting outside. The kitchen had a back exit, but reaching it meant exposing myself to the staircase. Then I remembered the upstairs bathroom. When I'd toured the place earlier, I'd noticed a small window above the tub. Not ideal, but maybe big enough to squeeze through. If I could make it upstairs before whoever was there came down, I might have a chance. It was insane, but it was the only plan I had. I moved toward the stairs as quietly as I could. Halfway there, I heard something that stopped me cold. A voice. Soft, calm, male, from the top of the stairs. "You can come out now." I nearly collapsed from the rush of fear. The voice continued. "You don't have to hide." It wasn't loud, it wasn't threatening. If anything, it sounded patient, almost soothing, and that somehow made it worse. I stayed perfectly still. Then came another voice, this one from outside the front window, also male. "She's still down there." My stomach dropped. There were two of them, one inside, one outside. The first voice answered from the staircase. "I know." Then silence. I bolted. Not upstairs, straight for the kitchen. Adrenaline overrode logic. I sprinted through the dining room, reached the back door, and fumbled for the lock. Behind me, pounding footsteps exploded down the stairs. I got the deadbolt turned just as someone slammed into me from behind. The force threw me sideways into the kitchen island. Pain shot through my ribs. I hit the floor hard. The man lunged for me. It was the delivery guy. His face was completely different up close, not blank anymore. Focused, cold. His eyes were sharp and alert. The vacant act at the door was exactly that, an act. He grabbed my ankle and yanked. I kicked wildly, connecting with his jaw. He cursed and lost his grip. I scrambled to my feet and snatched the nearest thing off the counter, a cast iron skillet. He came at me again. I swung with everything I had. The skillet connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He stumbled into the counter. Before he could recover, I ran, straight through the back door, into the dark yard. Cold night air hit me like a wall. I sprinted blindly across wet grass toward the neighboring house about 50 yards away. Behind me, shouting erupted. A second man had emerged from the side of the house. He was taller, broader, and he was running. I screamed as loud as I could, over and over. Lights snapped on in the neighboring home. A porch light flooded the yard. The taller man stopped instantly. He turned and sprinted back towards the rental. The other followed moments later, staggering. I reached the neighbor's porch just as an older couple opens the door. One look at me was enough. The husband pulled me inside and locked everything. The wife was already dialing 911. This time, help came fast. 3 squad cars arrived within minutes. Officers swept the rental house. The men were gone. So was the red sedan. At first, police thought they'd simply fled. Then they searched deeper. Inside an upstairs hall closet, they found sleeping bags, food wrappers, a portable signal jammer, and dozens of printed rental confirmations. Different names, different dates, all recent. The house wasn't just being used for short-term rentals, it was being used as bait. Derek, the owner, was arrested the following afternoon. Turns out he wasn't just the owner, he was related to one of the 2 men, his younger brother. The whole thing was a setup. They specifically targeted solo travelers, mostly men staying one night, people unlikely to raise immediate alarm. The fake delivery was their test, a way to see who was inside, whether they were alert, whether they were alone. If the target seemed easy enough, they'd move in after midnight. Police suspected robbery was the primary motive, but based on evidence found later, there were darker possibilities they never fully explained to me. What haunts me most is what happened the next morning. While giving my statement, one of the detectives handed me the brown paper bag the delivery man was holding. Inside was a cold, unopened pizza box. On top of it was a note, handwritten. It read, "If you open the screen door all the way, this ends quietly." I still think about that sentence, about how close I came to unlocking that screen door, about how casually I almost let him in. I got the job, by the way. Turned it down. Rachel and I stayed in Charleston, married 6 months later. Sometimes she jokes that Ashford Hollow scared me for settling down. Maybe she's right, but even now, whenever a doorbell rings late at night, I freeze. And if I ever stay somewhere unfamiliar, I don't just lock the doors. I check every closet, every room, every dark corner. Because sometimes the danger isn't outside trying to get in. Sometimes it's already waiting inside.